And good morning, Kitchissippi. For those who celebrate, happy Easter. I'm on my way to get the Sunday paper today, taking a chance that the magazine shop and the market will be open, and that there will be a print copy of the Sunday Star there. It's a beautiful morning. The streets, despite what I'm looking at right now, are getting cleaner, and my scooter is back on the road. Ordinarily, this is a trip that I would make it this time of year by scooter, probably scooter to the LRT. So I'm going to get the paper this morning by bike, get a little fitness in. But I thought, rather than just riding, I might take this opportunity to address some questions around how cities in Ontario are planned. I get a lot of questions about things like how new parks are built or new roads, transit infrastructure, what the interplay is in between the official plan and the comprehensive zoning bylaw, individual zoning applications. I know I've been asked to have a discussion with the group about, why doesn't the city defend zoning? And one of the revelations that that I had early on in my term was to really understand essentially how elegant the planning process is, at least on paper, for how cities in Ontario are planned. I remember having a similar kind of epiphany, if you will, when we learned when I learned in sort of executive school, the Canada School of Public Service, how the budget process works and how it all rolls down and rolls back up. And the planning process in Ontario is similarly elegant. You can start from the bottom and work your way to the top. But I thought this morning what I would do is actually start from the top and high-level considerations. Talk a little bit about how the provincial policy statement leads to an official plan, which leads to master plans, which leads to development charges bylaws. I think most residents are aware that in Canada, we have a constitution, some of it written down, some of it not. And that constitution, at least in the Constitution Act, defines two levels of government. There is a federal government and a provincial government. And if you're a city councillor, one of the first things you'll notice is that the Constitution, at least the written Constitution, doesn't speak to a municipal level of government. So in Canada, and this is different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction around the world, municipal affairs are the purview of the province. You'll sometimes hear that cities are the creatures of the province. We don't have any powers that are natural to our own sphere. Everything that we have is given to us by various different statutes. Cities in Ontario are corporations. If you've ever made note, you'll You notice that cities don't make laws. We make bylaws. And that's very similar to what you know from, private not-for-profit sector corporations. They have their bylaws, condominiums. We are kind of the same. But in Ontario, corporations or municipalities, municipal corporations, have various powers given to us by the Municipal Act, and importantly for what I want to explore while I ride today, the Planning Act as well. So given that municipal affairs are entirely the purview of the province, there are a number of statutes that have been created. And one of the most important directions to cities in Ontario with respect to how they'll grow is called the Provincial Policy Statement. Those in the know call it the PPS for obvious reasons. And what the PPS does is it is intended to describe to cities or give direction to cities about how they're going to grow. It doesn't tell them that they have to grow, but we know that populations increase. We try to get a handle on by how much, but certainly there are not a lot of municipalities in Ontario that are depopulating. And how cities grow has big implications for taxpayers, has big implications for the environment. The basic direction in the provincial policy statement to municipalities, there's a few of them, but what I'm interested in is the built form of the city. And what the province has told cities in Ontario is that as they grow, they're going to grow mostly through intensification, and that's to address the question of sprawl. And within the urban area, that intensification is going to be directed to areas like where I am right now, which is those areas that have, high transit potential. It costs taxpayers a lot of money to service sprawl. Initial growth is paid for by the new homeowners. But it's subsequently maintained and repaired and replaced by taxpayers. And the further away you are from the core, the longer a transit network you have to maintain, the less dense the neighborhoods are, the more that costs taxpayers. So the province has told us, you're going to grow mostly through intensification. And that's going to be focused on transit. That's not a current provincial government thing. I mean, that's a basic thrust in the provincial policy statement going back many years. So, in response to this provincial direction, every municipality in Ontario has to create what is called an official plan. This is a really long light, so I'm going to go hit that pedestrian button. And the official plan basically describes how are we going to handle the growth that is coming to the city in a way that is economically and environmentally sustainable. It starts with projections about how much we expect we're going to grow. That's not a target. It's not something we're trying to achieve. But in Ottawa, and folks will remember this maybe from the last official plan process, the population projections are turned into housing needs. So how many of house type X, how many of house type Y, how many people will live in those. In the case of our growth management strategy, and that's debatable. They can there's the opportunity for politicians to weigh in, disagree with methodologies, etc. But in Ottawa, we said, look, over the next 25 years, we're going to grow by 400,000 people. And that becomes the base number for how much housing we need. And how much housing we need ultimately gets turned into what kind of housing is allowed to be built where. It also implies things like, you know, the need for parks. It implies the need for employment areas, a transportation network. But we'll talk about those, I think, in a short bit. But the basics of it are, okay, we've figured out that we need to accommodate 400,000 people in the city. How are we going to do that in a way that respects the provincial policy statement, which has said that we're going to grow mostly through intensification? So in Ottawa, I hate that hill. So in Ottawa, what we said in our official plan is that we are going to achieve 51%. So that's a majority of our growth through intensification. That is 51% of those 400,000 people will need to live in areas of the city that are already serviced. Where there are sewer pipes, there's transit lines, there are roads, cycling networks. And then a little under 49% of our growth will be in areas of the city that are greenfield. There's an entire official plan process once you've made those decisions about adding land to what's called the urban boundary. In the last growth management strategy, the approved one, which became the foundation for the official plan, it was determined that we would need to add lands that are allowed to be developed over and above lands that were already deemed to be eligible for development. And thank you, buddy. Just heading into traffic here. And then once we've decided in which lands the development is going to be allowed to occur, we determine to what kind of density. And I should say we also have in that growth management strategy, we hold the sidelines that we intend to be used for employment and such. And what we said is, look, if we're going to have 200,000 people over the next 25 years living in areas of the city that are already serviced, then we're going to have to develop at a certain scale. And we know what the province's direction is with respect to scale. They want to see us focusing that intensification on transit areas. So we have most of our growth in the city directed to things like tall, dense buildings near transit, both current and future planned transit. Our traditional main streets will be served by mid-rise buildings, call them 6 to 9 stories. And then the neighborhoods that are already low-rise will, in many cases, remain low-rise, but they will be allowed to intensify at a greater low-rise scale. So, all those old single detached neighborhoods will see development with semi-detached buildings, triplexes, and where you get closer to the edge of the neighborhood, you'll see denser and taller. And as you approach the mid-rise areas, that official plan actually has to go to the Minister of Housing to be approved. I won't reiterate all the discussion we had around that. But it has been. So once you have an official plan that kind of describes how you're going to handle growth within the area, what is the urban boundary going to be? Where are the tallest and the densest buildings going to be? Where the employment land is going to be? Then you start to develop, I think, the documents that are probably or should be of greatest interest to people, which is the master plans. And master plans are where you start to get into the details of how the official plan will actually be implemented, and most importantly, how it's going to be paid for. So we can take, for example, the transportation master plan, which says, look, if you have a city that is focused on density here, employment here, what are the transit networks that you need? What is the road network that you're going to need? Where should the cycling infrastructure go? And those get turned into lists of projects, growth projects that you need in order to sustain the growth where you think the growth is going to be. Those lists of capital projects are going to be funded through development charges, which are paid by the developers of the new homes, and generally speaking are passed on to the new homeowners. Stop here, I think. But you can't just put together a list that is a wish list. Development charges are created under a statute the Development Charges Act, that tells you what can be charged development charges for, and really importantly, what the calculation is going to be for how much those will be. So you do what's called a development charges background study once you've got your master plan. So your master plan says, look, we're going to be intensifying in the city. We need to have, I don't know, light rail that goes from point A to point B. It is all tied to levels of service that are historical. So when you create a development charges background study, you can't suddenly say, oh, you know what? Everyone should get a 50-meter pool. Or we're going to build whatever we want in terms of transportation infrastructure. The level of service that you can provide through new infrastructure is calculated according to the level of service that you've been providing over some period, like the last 15 years. They have whole calculations say, look, if we widen this road, you know, 50% of that road widening is going to be to the benefit of new residents, and is the reason why we need to widen that road. But 50% of that is to the benefit of existing residents. You know, it's going to make change their commute. So it all gets calculated out, and you figure out for inside the Greenbelt, outside the Greenbelt, and citywide, how many people you're going to have. And then you charge a development charge. So we create those master plans that contain the capital projects that need to be built, and how that translates into the cost per every new door. Those funds go into reserve funds, or maybe we borrow and pay back that debt from the development charges that come in. Maybe a developer has built a piece of infrastructure that a new subdivision is going to need, and then they'll get paid back over time from the development charges that come in. There's never any such thing as free money. Where am I? Oh, gone the wrong way. That's good. That's beautiful out here. And then, I think that addresses how infrastructure gets built, and that includes things like parks and pools. So there is an infrastructure, or sorry, a parks and recreation master plan that describes what the growth projects are that need to be built in order to support the population at the same level at which we have been supporting it for some period of time historically. So if you read that parks plan, you'll see that we've identified the need for a new 50-meter pool within the Greenbelt, There's a certain number of splash pads that are required per certain capita. Green space comes under the Green Space Master Plan. And if new infrastructure is not supported within those master plans, then it is the taxpayer who pays for it. The principle, I think everywhere in North America, is that growth pays for growth. But again, we want to be careful how that growth infrastructure is built, because at some point it has to be maintained, renewed, replaced, and that can be on the taxpayer dime. I think the interesting discussion I know a lot of people want to have is around the comprehensive zoning bylaw review. I'm going to do this, or I'll do it this way. There's no traffic today. But I'm in the market now. Get myself onto the little cycle track there. So I think I'm going to hold that discussion for after I have picked up my newspaper. I'm taking a chance today that the newspaper store is open. It's Easter. See the sign up, so that's a good sign. So everything I talked about there in terms of parks or transportation, a major part of that whole discussion, of course, is sewers, water. And I like the look of this. Yeah, there it is. All right, so I'm going to go grab a newspaper. And then we'll resume the discussion. Good morning.
Did you put up the light?
Which one?
Did you put up the light?
I'm trying to remember which light.
The lights.
Oh yeah. Those are for Christmas time. Sort of November until the end of January. Thanks.
Starting it right now.
Yeah. Oh, it's getting warm, and they're getting the streets clean, which is nice. That makes it easier. Are you guys busy today? No.
It's Easter, you know?
Yeah, exactly. See you soon. Have a great weekend. Thank you. Wanna be your lover. Did you get the subject paper? I did. Good. Okay. All right, I've successfully gotten my Sunday paper. Let's start the music again. There we go. Be my lover. Yeah, let's check to make sure that I'm still getting some voice on this. My lover. Beautiful, still getting the voice. All right. Let us head back home. So what I'm going to do is actually head up to Mackenzie. There's a bi-directional cycle lane that'll take me right to Alexandra. I thought I'd get my first ride on the William Commander this morning. You know, there's an interesting example. The William Commander is, I know a lot of people conceive of it as having built a pedestrian cycling bridge, but really it's a bridge rehabilitation. We own that bridge. Tax dollars pay for it. It's not something that has been identified in a master plan in the list of capital projects that could have been paid by development charges. I think, you know, that's really what I want to emphasize is the most important things about master plans. You know, absolutely there is some policy in those documents, but the fights that you'll see, or the discussions, the disagreements between councillors are always around those capital projects. That's the most important part of the master plan. What are the capital projects that are in that plan? Because that will determine what we're collecting development charges for. With this part of town. All right. All right, so I know probably the most misunderstood planning concept or paradigm is how the official plan gets turned into zoning. You'll hear frequently from people who don't like a given development, why won't you defend the official plan? And it really is important to understand how those high-level principles in the provincial policy statement and in the official plan interact. Oh, I've got some music in the background, nice and low, the Venga bus. I got something to say. Oh. So basically, recall the provincial policy statement. Oh, I love that bridge. I mean, it's undercover, but that's going to be another game changer. Anyways, bus is coming and everybody's jumping. So you recall the provincial policy statement and the official plan describe at a very high level that growth is going to be managed mostly through intensification. And in the case of Ottawa's official plan, we said 51%. And that we're going to focus that growth on transit. So one of the important parts of the transportation master plan is to describe where the growth-funded transit projects are going to go. So you'll see things like, if we're going to grow by this amount, then we have to build a tram down Carling Avenue. We have to build BRT on Baseline. And then those become the areas where our official plan says that growth should be focused. So zoning is the very particular rules that describe what you can build on a given piece of property. And it's not everything. I think one of the things I've asked in my current capacity on council is that we stop saying that we're approving development. We don't approve development. We approve zoning. There's a lot of things that we don't approve when it comes to property development. We don't approve who the tenants are. We don't approve how much it's going to cost. We approve the zoning. And the zoning basically says, this is how big a building can be. And here's the use to which it can be put. And those aren't particularly super specific. We don't say, you know, this residential building on this property, I don't know, has to be a retirement home. You know, we never get that specific. We'd zone it for multi-unit residential, and then property owners under Ontario's, North America's property rights regimes have some pretty specific latitude, or have some significant latitude with respect to exactly what that's going to be. So we approve a kind of general use, industrial, open space, residential, commercial, and a size. You know, a big building, a small building. That starts to get a little more specific. Like we can zone that any building built on a property has to be X number of meters back from the property line. It can be no more than so many meters high. In the case of infill, that you can't have more than, you know, 4 units or 2 units or whatever. The rules that say it has to be a single are now gone. The province mandated that, although we would have done that anyways, I think. It's the right thing to do. And in an ideal world, when your official plan changes to allow, say, greater density or height than what the existing zoning on the property says today, you would update all the zoning. Because it works going up, if I can put it that way. Our official plan has to meet the provincial policy statement. Our zoning has to match the official plan. So what will happen is a developer will have a parcel of land, and it may have zoning on it that constrains them to a certain height or density or use. And they'll determine that, you know, in order to make the most money they can from a given property, that they want something that is denser or taller, or that allows for more profitable use. And in Ontario, every property owner has the right to ask a city council to rezone a property. And what they're going to try to do, Cobra chicken. Ooh, let's get some Cobra chicken. On your left. So what they're going to do is they're going to make the argument to City Council that the use they're proposing is compliant with the official plan. And if I can turn that around, if we refuse the request, that refusal is appealable to a provincial appeals body called the Ontario Land Tribunal. I'll just get to the top of this hill. You can tell I have not been on my bike in a while. So the argument the developer will make is that the zoning they're asking for is compliant with the official plan. So for example, you know, there might be a property that today is an R1. But our newest official plan says it's an area where we anticipate denser, still low-rise housing. So the developer will argue, your official plan says this is where I should be allowed to build maybe a triplex, maybe a low-rise apartment building. We're going to vote on that as a city council, and then our vote is appealable to the Ontario Land Tribunal. And I think the example that I use most often is the Trailhead building that is at the corner of McRae and Scott. There is a secondary plan for that area. At the time, I think it was about 11 years old. And secondary plans are basically, they're intended to be precision around what the official plan means for a much more specific geography. And that secondary plan said, you know what, this property where the trailhead is should be constrained to a 4 to 6 story building. Well, Westboro Transit Station is right there. And the developer very legitimately asserted that our own official plan calls for, and this was true of the official plan that was in place at the time, you know, taller, denser housing near LRT stations. Unfortunately, there was no modern defensible secondary plan, because obviously 4 to 6 stories in front of the transit station to any reasonable observer does not meet the provincial policy statement or the official plan. But the new height as official plan evolved wasn't set out. So you had zoning that was, you know, well, I think the secondary plan said 4 to 6 stories. The zoning itself may have said something like 4 stories. So then it becomes a one-off zoning fight where many residents would like to hold the line on the height. The developers want to bust it out. And they wound up getting 26, which kind of established a new baseline for Scott. Although today I would suggest that baseline is closer probably to 32 stories. In the low-rise neighborhoods, oh, I hate this hill. Basically just stand on these pedals. Oh, there's the bridge. So in the low-rise areas, we have a lot of zoning that, frankly, comes from the 1960s that protects relatively small homes with big setbacks on fairly large lots. And that is difficult to justify in light of what the official plan says today. So the exercise that we're undertaking now is to actually match the zoning with what our official plan says. Absolutely beautiful out here. So the discussion that I wind up having with residents, over and over again, is how to participate in these one-off zoning discussions. Keeping in mind that the city's decision is basically constrained to, does the application in front of us adhere to the official plan or not? The developer will have submitted as part of their application a planning rationale. And that is the most important document for residents who want to participate in these, because it will set out the basis upon which the developer considers that their application is compliant with the zoning bylaw or with the official plan. It is open to residents who wish to oppose a development to argue that point, to say that it is not compliant with the official plan. And what that comes down to is chapter and verse official plan, chapter and verse provincial policy statement. And I think what we get probably too frequently is we get the arguments about what people don't like, and that's fine. But if council goes beyond the argument that is in front of it, which is this is compliant or not with our official plan and with the provincial policy statement, various policies and guidelines that guide and direct growth in Ottawa and Ontario, and we veer into areas that are outside of our jurisdiction, when the developer appeals a refusal to the Ontario Land Tribunal, we will lose those battles. And you'll see that when council makes political decisions, we lose those battles in front of the tribunal. And back to Bayview. So the most important thing is to have zoning in place that reflects what the official plan actually says. So that, well, generally speaking, the most sophisticated developers will not apply for zoning that they know is likely to be refused on the grounds that the zoning is reflective of the official plan. I think one of the best examples I can think of for that is Mechanicsville, right after we passed a new secondary plan that included that geography. And the secondary plan, unlike some secondary plans, was very much written to be compliant with the official plan, compliant with the provincial policy statement, so that it would be a very high bar to try to argue for a rezoning when the zoning has been very carefully crafted to reflect what the secondary plan says. So actually, we're not far from it right now. Mechanicsville off to my right here. I want to say relatively new developer. So like we had zoning that said, look, we're going to have taller, denser buildings on Parkdale. And then once you come in from Parkdale, we're going to limit the height to 4 stories. And the developer came in and said, well, you're near Tunney's pasture. I should get 8. But our secondary plan, reflected what was in that version of the official plan, to say there's going to be a transition. We're going to put tall, dense buildings up against Parkdale. It's a big street. It's right up against the Tunney's Pasture Transit Station, but it's going to transition down into the low-rise neighborhood. So that developer, they brought their 8 stories to the community. We told them, you can't do that. And then the application went to the city planners. And the city planners were unconvinced by the developer's argument. And then it's not something that we get to see, but what I presume is that the developer said, look, if you persist in, the planner said, if you persist in this, I'll send it along to planning committees, send it along to council with the recommendation that you refuse. And planning committee, council tend to have a fairly, significant deference to what city staff say. We know that they are looking at this through the lens of what the tribunal is likely to do. So the developer, we just never saw that 8-story proposal again. And I believe the next thing I knew, there was a technical approval in front of me for a 4-story building that was compliant with the secondary plan. It was still bigger than what the zoning called for. And they had to seek a rezoning, if I recall. But generally at that point, we're talking about tweaks. So today, we have a new official plan. And we really need to update the zoning as often as we update the official plan, because each iteration of the official plan becomes more and more focused on intensification. Taller buildings near transit, taller buildings near the edges of neighborhoods. And there comes a point when the zoning that's in place, if it hasn't been updated, is simply woefully out of step with what the official plan actually says. And if we want to avoid these kind of one-off rezoning battles, the most important thing is to have zoning in place that reflects what the official plan actually says. So when people ask, like, why don't you defend the zoning? It's because usually what we have is a recommendation in front of us that the zoning no longer reflects the official plan. And that is very likely, in light of the fact that in many cases, our zoning is a mishmash of zoning that was in place at amalgamation, some of which had been in place since the late 1960s, when the car was king. Cities grew by sprawl. Anyways, I hope that's somewhat helpful. Enjoy the long weekend. Hi.